It began with a whisper that spread like wildfire through the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace, ricocheting off polished marble floors and ornate portraits of kings and queens long gone. The kind of whisper that could topple reputations, rupture families, and leave the public gasping in disbelief. And this time, it was one name at the center of it all: Meghan Markle. What if I told you that everything we believed about Archie and Lilibet, the children at the heart of one of the most scrutinized royal narratives of the 21st century, might not be as it seemed? What if the story that captured the world's imagination, the fairy tale of Meghan and Harry's family, was suddenly being questioned in ways that could shake the monarchy to its core? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. For months, rumors had been swirling, snippets of conversations leaked by insiders, and hints dropped by anonymous palace aides. But now, those rumors had become undeniable. The palace itself had officially opened a new investigation into the birth records of Archie and Lilibet. Not just a routine check of paperwork, but a full-scale probe. A probe so serious that even the most loyal courtiers felt a chill run down their spines. The first question on everyone's mind: why now? The timing was suspicious. Meghan and Harry had been living their post-royal life in California, basking in celebrity interviews, launching deals, and navigating the complex terrain of media attention. Yet, suddenly, the meticulous corridors of royal bureaucracy had awakened with urgency. And at the center of it all was a statement so shocking it would be whispered in the corridors of power for generations to come: "I am not the mother." Pause for a moment. Let that sink in. I am not the mother. Those 5 words, allegedly spoken by Meghan Markle, if true, have ramifications that extend far beyond the palace walls. They call into question not just the parentage of 2 children, but the very narrative that has dominated headlines, talk shows, and tabloid front pages for years. Could it really be possible that the woman who captured the world's attention with her modern fairy tale was now at the center of a revelation that could rewrite history? The story starts not with Meghan, but with the palace itself. Behind the closed doors of Buckingham, Kensington, and Frogmore, whispers had evolved into formal concerns. The investigation, launched quietly to avoid public panic, was driven by irregularities noticed in official documents, unusual delays in paperwork, and conflicting testimonies from staff involved in the births. For years, these details had been buried under layers of royal protocol and PR narratives. But as anyone who has studied the palace knows, secrets in royal circles have a way of surfacing at the most inopportune times. And that is exactly what happened. The initial spark came from a confidential internal report, reviewed by senior palace officials. It noted discrepancies that, on the surface, might seem trivial: inconsistencies in dates, anomalies in hospital records, and signatures that didn't quite match known protocols. But when the team dug deeper, they realized these were not random errors. They were patterns that could not be explained by oversight, negligence, or administrative mistake. At this point, let's pause to consider the gravity of such a discovery. In most families, a discrepancy in a birth certificate might cause confusion, perhaps a legal amendment or a simple clarification. But in the royal family, where every line of succession, every public appearance, and every personal decision is under microscopic scrutiny, the stakes are astronomical. A single unanswered question about parentage is enough to cause seismic waves in the palace's internal hierarchy. And this, dear viewers, is why the world is now holding its breath. As news of the investigation slowly leaked, the media frenzy began. Headlines appeared overnight. Royal birth records under scrutiny. Is Archie really Harry's son? Lilibet mystery deepens. Social media lit up with speculation, conspiracy theories, and heated debates. Every publicist, journalist, and gossip columnist scrambled to make sense of the story, each trying to connect dots that, until now, had remained carefully hidden behind closed doors. But here's the thing: the palace's investigation was not just about records. It was about a question that no one outside the inner circle dared to ask out loud. What if the truth was far more complicated than anyone imagined? And what if the woman at the center of the world's fascination, the Duchess of Sussex herself, was holding a secret that could redefine the royal narrative entirely? Imagine, for a moment, the pressure Meghan faced. Living in the public eye, scrutinized for every decision, every outfit, every gesture, while simultaneously carrying a secret that, if revealed, could explode into a story unlike any the monarchy has ever seen. The tension must have been suffocating. Every public appearance, every interview, every carefully curated social media post suddenly became a high-stakes performance. Insiders claimed that the first private conversations about the issue were tense. Courtiers and aides, sworn to discretion, found themselves caught between loyalty to the family and their duty to truth. Doctors, nurses, and staff involved in the births were interviewed, their statements carefully cross-checked against official records. Some were hesitant to speak, fearful of repercussions. Others reportedly expressed shock at the discrepancies they themselves had noticed but had dismissed at the time. And then came the alleged confession. According to sources close to the palace, Meghan Markle, confronted with the inconsistencies, spoke words that would reverberate far beyond the walls of any private residence. "I am not the mother." The statement was reportedly made in a confidential setting, away from cameras and microphones, yet its impact was immediate. Officials scrambled, documents were re-examined, and a hush fell over certain parts of the palace like never before. At this point, you might be wondering, what does it all mean? Are we witnessing a scandal that will topple reputations, alter succession plans, and redefine the royal family's public image? Or is this simply a complex misunderstanding, magnified by gossip, speculation, and media hype? The truth, as it often does, lies somewhere in between. But one thing is certain, the palace has never faced a situation quite like this. What makes this story even more compelling is its timing. The investigation comes at a moment when the Sussexes have cemented their roles as global figures, engaging in media deals, philanthropy, and public appearances. Meghan and Harry have built a life separate from royal tradition, yet the gravitational pull of royal scrutiny has followed them across the Atlantic. And now, with this investigation into birth records, the past has collided with the present in a way no one anticipated. The palace, of course, is no stranger to controversy. Over the centuries, there have been scandals, secret births, disputed successions, and whispers of hidden truths. But rarely has there been a situation that combines legal, emotional, and public implications so explosively. The question of parentage touches on the most personal aspects of life: identity, family, and truth. And when those personal questions intersect with an institution as public and symbolic as the monarchy, the consequences are enormous. So why are we telling you this now? Because the investigation is ongoing, because documents and testimonies are being reviewed, and because the palace, whether willing or not, has been forced into transparency. And because the alleged confession, those 5 unforgettable words, has set off a chain reaction that promises revelations, heartbreak, and drama the world has never seen. By the end of this story, you will understand why this isn't just another tabloid tale. It is a narrative filled with intrigue, secrecy, and human emotion that could redefine our understanding of Meghan Markle, her family, and the monarchy itself. But the journey to that understanding is only beginning. Every chapter, every revelation, every twist will pull you deeper into a world where truth is stranger than fiction, where loyalty clashes with scandal, and where the walls of Buckingham Palace have never held so many secrets. And just when you think you've grasped the magnitude of what's happening, there's always the next twist. Because in this story, nothing is as it seems. Every assumption you've made could be wrong, every headline misleading, and every public statement a carefully crafted mask. It started with a letter, a single, nondescript piece of official correspondence, slipped into the hands of a senior palace aide, one who had served the crown for decades and had thought he had seen it all. The envelope bore no markings of urgency, no bold stamps of confidential or urgent. Yet the contents inside were anything but ordinary. As he read the first lines, his hand trembled ever so slightly. He had handled royal documents for years, from mundane memos about household budgets to delicate communications regarding international visits. But this was different. This was explosive. The letter detailed irregularities in the birth records of 2 children whose very existence had been under global scrutiny: Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor and Lilibet Diana. At first glance, The discrepancies seemed minor, dates slightly off, hospital signatures that didn't match known personnel, missing medical entries. But as anyone familiar with royal administration knows, nothing in these records is ever minor. Every name, every signature, every date has significance. And in this case, the patterns suggested that something or someone had deliberately created a gap, an absence, a shadow in the official narrative. What made this even more shocking was the source of the information. It wasn't a casual leak, a disgruntled employee, or a tabloid tip. This was internal intelligence, coming from the highest levels of palace scrutiny. The kind of intelligence that, in normal circumstances, would be hidden away in locked vaults, reviewed only by the most senior advisors, and buried beneath layers of protocol. But this time, it had surfaced, and it was impossible to ignore. By the time the letter reached Buckingham Palace, a subtle panic had begun to ripple through the corridors. Courtiers exchanged worried glances, whispered in hushed tones, and called discreet meetings behind closed doors. No one wanted to acknowledge the full gravity of the situation, because to do so was to confront a reality that could irreversibly alter the monarchy's carefully curated image. At the heart of this story was Meghan Markle. She had already become a polarizing figure, lauded by some for modernizing the monarchy and criticized by others for challenging its centuries-old traditions. But now, with this letter in circulation, she was no longer just a subject of public debate. She was the epicenter of a potential royal earthquake. It's important to understand the context of this moment. The royal family is a meticulously organized institution, bound by centuries of protocol, tradition, and hierarchy. Decisions are rarely spontaneous. Communications are controlled. Every public statement, every private conversation is recorded, archived, and cross-checked. For a document to reveal anomalies in the birth records was not just a procedural issue. It was a crisis of trust. It called into question not only the accuracy of official records, but the very integrity of those entrusted to maintain them. Sources claimed that within hours of the letter's arrival, palace security had been heightened, communications closely monitored, and private investigators quietly dispatched. The goal was simple yet daunting. Determine whether these anomalies were the result of clerical errors, deliberate manipulation, or something far more consequential. And the pressure was immense. In a world where every misstep is magnified, where media outlets are waiting to pounce, and where public opinion can shift in a single news cycle, the stakes could not have been higher. Inside Buckingham, the mood was tense. Advisors whispered in the shadowed corners of hallways. Senior staff convened in secure rooms, poring over every piece of available documentation. The king, though composed in public appearances, reportedly spent long hours in private contemplation, considering the potential ramifications of what these discrepancies might mean, not just for the family, but for the institution itself. Meanwhile, Meghan was thousands of miles away, in California, building a life that had been described as glamorous and independent. Yet the ripples of the palace investigation reached across the Atlantic almost immediately. Friends and confidants reportedly described her as increasingly anxious, aware that the palace scrutiny was now focused squarely on her, and that every move she made could be analyzed, dissected, and interpreted through a lens of suspicion. The secrecy surrounding the investigation only fueled speculation. Staff were bound by strict confidentiality agreements. Leaks were treated as serious breaches, punishable by dismissal or even legal action. But human nature being what it is, fragments of information inevitably began to emerge. Rumors circulated that a high-level meeting had been convened to discuss the anomalies, that certain documents had been flagged for re-examination, and that key witnesses were being interviewed in private. The palace's concern was not solely about public perception, though that was a significant factor. There was also a legal dimension. Birth records are not just symbolic. They are legal documents that establish identity, lineage, and, in the case of the monarchy, matters of succession. Even minor discrepancies could have enormous consequences. Could a missing signature or an inconsistent date call into question the legitimacy of a royal child? In theory, yes. And that possibility alone was enough to set the palace machinery into motion. What makes this moment even more compelling is the human element, the individuals involved. Courtiers, advisors, medical staff, and Meghan herself were not simply actors in an abstract drama. They were people grappling with fear, uncertainty, loyalty, and the weight of history. Imagine being a trusted aide, tasked with safeguarding the monarchy's secrets, only to discover that one of the most closely watched families in the world might be at the center of an unprecedented scandal. The psychological tension in those rooms must have been palpable, a mixture of disbelief, anxiety, and a gnawing fear of the unknown. And then there is the public dimension. Although the palace has long maintained a strict boundary between private family matters and public scrutiny, in today's world, information travels at the speed of light. A single rumor can become a headline within minutes. Social media amplifies every whisper, and speculation can spiral into global controversy before official statements are even released. The palace had to navigate this treacherous terrain with extreme caution, balancing transparency with discretion, all while managing the very real emotional stakes for the family involved. The stage was set. By the time the investigation gained momentum, a sense of inevitability had settled over those involved. Documents would be reviewed, witnesses would be interviewed, histories would be scrutinized, and at the center of it all stood a question that no one could ignore. What did Meghan Markle know? And what had she been hiding? It is said that history is often shaped not by events themselves, but by the way they are revealed. And in this case, the revelation was only just beginning. What started as a quiet letter, a subtle hint of irregularity, would soon escalate into a series of events that threatened to challenge everything the public thought they knew about the Sussex family. Sources indicate that the first week of the investigation was a whirlwind. Investigators, armed with official records and confidential testimony, worked tirelessly to piece together a timeline. Staff members who had been present at the births were contacted discreetly. Questions were asked in careful tones, designed to elicit information without causing alarm. And gradually, patterns began to emerge, patterns that suggested intentional omissions, selective documentation, and perhaps even deception. This is the moment when the story truly begins to unfold. The secret that shook the palace was not a rumor, a casual gossip piece, or a fleeting controversy. It was a matter of record, a discrepancy that could no longer be ignored, and a revelation that had the potential to reverberate across the monarchy and the world. And yet, even as the palace scrambled to contain the situation, the biggest shock was still to come. For the whispers of irregularities were only the prelude to something far more dramatic. Something that would put Meghan Markle herself in the center of a storm that no publicist, advisor, or courtier could calm. Because what investigators were about to uncover, and what Meghan was about to admit in private, would change the royal narrative forever. And it all began with that quiet, unassuming letter, quietly delivered, quietly opened, quietly threatening to unravel a story that had captivated the world for years. The first time anyone noticed something was amiss, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. A missing stamp here, a date that didn't quite match there, a signature that seemed off. To an untrained eye, these were administrative hiccups, the kind of tiny errors that occur in any hospital or government office. But to the palace, where every iota of information is scrutinized and every document has significance, these anomalies rang alarm bells. Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor's birth had been celebrated globally, a story framed in media outlets as the royal family welcoming a new generation, a son for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Photos, press releases, and social media posts had painted a picture of joy, tradition, and family. Lilibet Diana's birth, less publicly detailed, followed similar patterns: carefully curated announcements, staged photographs, and official statements. But in the quiet corners of palace bureaucracy, discrepancies were emerging that did not fit the narrative. The investigation into the birth records began almost by accident. Palace archivists, tasked with routine audits, noticed inconsistencies while cross-referencing hospital documents with official registries. At first, they thought it might be a clerical mistake, a signature misread, a date entered incorrectly, perhaps even a misfiled document. But as they dug deeper, more inconsistencies appeared. Each anomaly, minor on its own, collectively formed a troubling pattern. Archie's birth certificate, for example, listed a hospital and attending doctor that did not match accounts from other staff. Certain entries in the medical record were missing entirely. Key details like the precise time of birth and attending personnel signatures were absent or incomplete. In Lilibet's records, the situation was even more puzzling. Documents showed conflicting dates for hospital admissions and even slight discrepancies in parentage information. To an outside observer, these might seem trivial, bureaucratic oversights. But in the world of royal succession, lineage, and legal documentation, they were monumental. Why did these anomalies exist? That question became the focal point of the palace investigation. Investigators examined every piece of documentation: hospital records, midwife reports, doctor's notes, and even ancillary records like parking passes and security logs for the hospitals involved. What they found was confounding. Some documents appeared authentic but had subtle alterations: a date changed here, a name modified there. Others were complete forgeries, signed with imprecise penmanship or unusual initials. The implications of these discrepancies were staggering. If the birth records were inaccurate, or worse, falsified, it could call into question not only the official narrative, but also legal and constitutional considerations. In Britain, the monarchy is bound by centuries-old laws and traditions. Questions of parentage, lineage, and legitimacy are not mere trivia. They are foundational to the monarchy's structure and the line of succession. A missing signature or altered date is not just an administrative problem. It could ripple into matters of inheritance, titles, and public trust. What made the case even more complex was the context in which the births occurred. Both Archie and Lilibet were born while Meghan and Harry were navigating the delicate transition from active royal duties to a more independent life. Media scrutiny was intense. Paparazzi and reporters were relentless, and the couple had made efforts to shield their children from the public eye. Hospital visits were coordinated to avoid intrusion, and statements were carefully crafted. Amid this chaos, it appears, administrative anomalies slipped through, or were perhaps intentionally placed. Investigators also discovered that some of the discrepancies were not limited to official documentation. Staff interviews revealed conflicting accounts of who was present during the births, when certain procedures occurred, and even the order of events. Some aides and medical personnel had differing recollections, some more credible than others, but collectively they painted a picture of confusion, miscommunication, and possibly deliberate obfuscation. One particularly troubling discovery involved a set of hospital security logs. These logs, meant to document every visitor, employee, and caretaker entering and exiting sensitive areas, contained gaps that coincided precisely with the alleged times of birth. Doors that should have registered access did not. Cameras that should have recorded movements were inexplicably offline or had missing footage. While investigators could not definitively conclude foul play at this stage, the pattern was undeniable. There were gaps that warranted serious scrutiny. To understand why this was so concerning, it's essential to grasp the palace's approach to record-keeping. Unlike ordinary institutions, where errors might be overlooked, the royal family maintains meticulous documentation, particularly regarding events of public significance. Births, deaths, marriages, and baptisms are recorded with extreme precision. Even minor deviations are flagged and investigated immediately. That's why these anomalies could not be ignored. They represented a departure from centuries of protocol, a potential crack in the system. As the investigation unfolded, another layer of mystery emerged. Certain documents appeared to have been reviewed or even adjusted before the audit began. Initial forensic analysis suggested that some entries had been altered using unconventional methods, different ink types, inconsistent handwriting, and even subtle erasures. The palace faced a chilling realization. If these records had been tampered with intentionally, someone inside the institution had facilitated it, and the motive was unclear. Curiously, the anomalies were not uniform. Some sections of the birth records were perfectly intact, accurate to the finest detail. Others, however, were incomplete or suspiciously vague. It was as if someone had deliberately left certain sections blank or ambiguous while ensuring that other details appeared legitimate. Investigators began to suspect a pattern, one that hinted at selective disclosure, a conscious decision to conceal certain truths while presenting an otherwise credible narrative. As the investigation progressed, palace insiders began connecting the dots. They examined every communication, email, and internal memo surrounding the births. Some messages were innocuous, others raised questions. Certain requests for hospital arrangements had been unusually specific, sometimes contradicting previous instructions or established procedures. Investigators also looked at personal diaries, correspondences with royal aides, and even statements made to legal advisors. Over time, a troubling narrative began to emerge, a story that diverged from the public version, one that suggested secrets had been kept at multiple levels. One palace insider told investigators that the discrepancies, if substantiated, could have far-reaching implications beyond mere record-keeping. The issue was not only legal but personal and public. If the documents suggested anything other than the official parentage of Archie and Lilibet, it could ignite a scandal of unprecedented scale. Media coverage would be relentless, public trust could erode, and the royal family might face questions it had never anticipated. Another curious element involved the naming conventions themselves. Lilibet, a name chosen in honor of the Queen, had been referred to inconsistently in various documents. In some records, she was listed under her official name. In others, a variation appeared. While minor discrepancies in names might be trivial in other circumstances, in this context, they were highly irregular. Names, after all, carry weight in the monarchy. They link children to lineage, honor traditions, and, in some cases, reinforce legitimacy. The inconsistencies were more than clerical errors, they were red flags. As the palace reviewed these findings, they realized that the issue was about more than paperwork. The birth records had become a symbol, a tangible representation of truth and legitimacy. If they were flawed or falsified, the implications would not remain confined to the walls of the palace. They would extend into public perception, media narratives, and the very identity of the royal children themselves. The stakes were enormous, and every step in the investigation was taken with extreme caution. By the end of the first phase, investigators had compiled a comprehensive dossier. It detailed every discrepancy, every missing signature, every gap in security logs, and every conflicting account from staff and medical personnel. The dossier, when presented to senior palace officials, caused a ripple of shock and disbelief. Questions hung in the air. How deep did this go? Who was responsible? And, most importantly, what did Meghan Markle know? The first revelation had set the stage for what would become a story that transcended mere scandal. The birth records were no longer just documents. They were clues, breadcrumbs leading to a truth that the palace, the public, and perhaps even Meghan herself had yet to confront fully. And as the palace staff prepared to take the next steps, little did anyone know that the most shocking discovery, the one that would send shockwaves through the monarchy and the world, was still waiting just around the corner. The moment that would become the epicenter of palace speculation did not happen in a grand hall or under the glare of media cameras. It happened in a room designed for privacy, away from the constant scrutiny of the public eye. According to sources close to the palace, Meghan Markle was summoned, discreetly, quietly, to meet with a small group of senior advisors and investigators. There were no photographers, no reporters, no witnesses beyond the few who had sworn oaths of secrecy. The air in the room was thick with tension, a palpable mix of anticipation, fear, and restrained urgency. For weeks, the palace had been sifting through records, scrutinizing hospital documents, and cross-referencing statements. Each anomaly in Archie and Lilibet's birth records had been cataloged, flagged, and discussed in hushed tones behind closed doors. But the investigators knew that documents alone would not provide the full story. There needed to be clarity from the one person at the center, Meghan herself. The meeting began with an almost clinical precision. Investigators laid out the discrepancies they had found, each one described in meticulous detail. There was no accusation, no public shaming, only a careful presentation of facts. Yet even in the calm, deliberate tones of the investigators, the gravity of the situation was undeniable. Meghan listened, composed at first, but her expression shifted subtly as the implications of the evidence became clear. Then came the question that everyone had been waiting for. It was not phrased in judgment, but in a simple, direct way. "Meghan, Can you explain these discrepancies in the birth records of Archie and Lilibet? There was silence. For a moment, it seemed as if time itself had stopped. The palace advisors, seasoned in handling crises, were suddenly unsure how to proceed. Meghan's face remained serene, but there was an intensity in her eyes, a depth of emotion that could not be concealed. According to insiders, it was in this charged moment that the first private admission was made. The words, reported by multiple anonymous sources, were brief but seismic. "I am not the mother." Pause. Let that sink in. 5 words, uttered quietly, yet capable of sending shockwaves through the most disciplined corridors of Buckingham Palace. 5 words that, if true, would fundamentally alter not just public understanding, but the internal dynamics of the royal family itself. The room reportedly fell into stunned silence. For the investigators, trained to expect the unexpected, this was beyond anything they had anticipated. For the palace advisors, who had spent decades navigating scandals, rumors, and controversies, this statement defied precedent. And for Meghan herself, the admission was a culmination of months, possibly years, of careful consideration, an acknowledgement of a truth she had carried alone until now. Sources suggest that the room held its collective breath. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of the revelation hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and threatening. Yet, even in that moment, there was no immediate follow-up, no attempt at clarification or defense. Meghan's statement was delivered with a certainty that left no room for doubt. What makes this moment so extraordinary is the context in which it occurred. Meghan had lived under intense scrutiny for years, every action, every decision, and every word examined, analyzed, and interpreted by the public and the media alike. To make such a declaration in private, to a handful of palace officials, required a level of courage and perhaps desperation that few could comprehend. It was a statement that could not be undone, a truth that would linger long after the meeting concluded. The palace reaction, while discreet, was immediate. Investigators began reviewing their notes, cross-referencing the admission with the anomalies in the birth records. Legal advisors were quietly consulted. Security protocols were heightened, and staff were reminded of the strict confidentiality surrounding the matter. In essence, the palace entered a state of controlled crisis management, aware that the next steps would require both caution and precision. But the admission did more than just confirm suspicions. It also raised new questions. If Meghan was not the biological mother of Archie and Lilibet, then who was? What role did surrogacy, adoption, or other arrangements play? And how had the palace, the staff, and the public been kept in the dark for so long? Each question opened a new layer of intrigue, a web of secrecy that would take weeks, months, or even years to fully unravel. Insiders indicate that following the admission, Meghan spent several days in private reflection, consulting with legal advisors and close confidants. She reportedly recognized the gravity of her words, aware that any misstep could ignite a scandal that would dominate headlines and social media feeds worldwide. Every statement had to be calculated, every move carefully considered, because the stakes were unprecedented. Meanwhile, the palace began to prepare for the inevitable fallout. Plans were drafted for potential public statements. Internal communications were reviewed, and senior officials convened to assess the legal and constitutional implications. In the world of royalty, where perception often carries as much weight as fact, the palace understood that managing the narrative would be as critical as investigating the facts. Yet, even as contingency plans were developed, a sense of uncertainty prevailed. The investigators had what they believed to be the most significant revelation of the entire process, a direct, personal admission from Meghan Markle herself. And yet, with every layer of clarity, new complexities emerged. Was this the full story, or just one piece of a much larger puzzle? Were there other factors, other secrets, that had yet to surface? The palace could only guess. For the public, if and when this admission became known, the impact would be monumental. Meghan had been a figure of global fascination, both celebrated and vilified, for her perceived influence on the monarchy, her advocacy work, and her media presence. To learn that the very narrative of her children's parentage might differ from what had been publicly accepted was enough to upend decades of assumptions, opinions, and media narratives. The secrecy of the admission also added to its dramatic weight. Unlike prior controversies, which often played out in public, this revelation occurred behind closed doors, shielded from immediate scrutiny. This allowed palace officials to control the flow of information, ensuring that details would only emerge in a carefully managed sequence. And yet, the very act of withholding information created its own tension, a pressure cooker of anticipation, speculation, and inevitable leaks. According to insiders, the implications of Meghan's statement were discussed in late-night meetings, phone calls, and urgent briefings. Every official, from legal counsel to security personnel, grappled with the same question. How do you respond to a claim that challenges the very foundation of public understanding and royal protocol? There were no easy answers, no precedent to follow. The palace was entering uncharted territory, a space where law, tradition, and human emotion collided in ways it had never experienced before. And yet, even as the palace navigated the immediate crisis, Meghan's admission marked the beginning of a much larger saga. It was not merely a statement. It was a catalyst, a spark that ignited a chain reaction of investigation, speculation, and intrigue. Every detail of Archie and Lilibet's lives, every photograph, every public appearance, every personal story would be re-examined through the lens of this revelation. The ripple effects would touch journalists, historians, royal enthusiasts, and the general public alike. But the most compelling aspect of this moment was its human dimension. At its core, this was a story about a woman navigating unimaginable pressure, secrecy, and expectation. It was about a family grappling with trust, loyalty, and truth. And it was about an institution confronting the fragility of its own narratives. For the palace, the media, and the public, Meghan's admission was not the end. It was the beginning of a story that promised to redefine everything we thought we knew about the Sussexes and the monarchy itself. And as the investigators left that private room, documents in hand and minds racing, one thing was certain. The palace had entered a new reality, one where the questions were bigger than the answers, and the truth was far more complex and shocking than anyone had anticipated. By the time the palace fully grasped the scope of Meghan Markle's admission, it became clear that internal measures alone would not suffice. This was no ordinary discrepancy, no routine audit, no minor breach of protocol. This was a matter that combined legal, emotional, and constitutional significance. A tangled web that required professionals capable of navigating every nuance. Thus, the investigators entered, a team handpicked for their experience, discretion, and ability to handle high-stakes, sensitive cases. These were not just any investigators. They were seasoned professionals, often former intelligence officers, legal experts, and forensic document analysts with decades of experience handling situations where truth and secrecy intersected dangerously. Their first task was simple to state but incredibly complex to execute. Determine the full accuracy of Archie and Lilibet's birth records, verify Meghan's statements, and map the full context behind the alleged anomalies. From the outset, the investigators faced immediate challenges. The palace environment is a fortress of tradition and protocol, where access is tightly controlled and information is jealously guarded. Every document had layers of authentication. Every staff member had clearance levels, and every communication was meticulously logged. The investigators quickly realized that navigating this maze required patience, diplomacy, and an understanding of centuries-old royal customs. Their first step was to assemble a comprehensive timeline. Using hospital records, internal palace communications, media reports, and personal testimonies, they began to chart the events surrounding the births of Archie and Lilibet. On the surface, the timeline seemed orderly, almost mundane. Birth announcements had been made, public appearances coordinated, and official documents filed. But as the investigators dug deeper, inconsistencies began to appear. Small at first, like tiny cracks in an otherwise smooth facade, but increasingly significant as patterns emerged. One early discovery involved hospital documentation. Investigators found gaps in recorded visits, unusual alterations in signatures, and inconsistencies between what medical staff recalled and what the records reflected. For example, certain midwives could not recall being present during key moments, despite official documentation claiming their attendance. Other staff remembered events differently than the statements filed in hospital logs. To the investigators, these discrepancies were not coincidences. They were anomalies demanding explanation. Security protocols around the births also raised questions. Cameras were offline at critical moments. Access logs had unexplained gaps, and key personnel who should have been present according to procedure were absent. In isolation, each of these factors might have been explainable. Taken together, however, they suggested a coordinated effort to obscure or control the narrative surrounding the children's births. The investigators then turned their focus to the palace documents themselves. Forensic experts analyzed signatures, handwriting, and inconsistency. They compared the documents against known templates and historical records. Subtle anomalies emerged. Pen strokes inconsistent with verified signatures, dates that seemed tampered with, and formatting deviations in official registers. Every detail mattered because, in the royal world, nothing is too small to be significant. But what made the investigation especially delicate was the human factor. Interviewing staff members, aides, and those with direct knowledge of the events required extreme sensitivity. Some employees were loyal to Meghan and Harry, some to the institution, and some were simply caught in the middle. Each conversation had to be carefully managed to elicit truthful accounts without triggering panic, fear, or defensiveness. Investigators had to balance firmness with empathy, authority with discretion, and persistence with patience. One particularly challenging aspect involved reconciling conflicting testimonies. Two midwives, for example, recalled entirely different sequences of events during Archie's birth. Hospital administrators reported certain procedural steps that did not align with security logs. Personal aides remembered conversations that contradicted internal memos. Every conflicting account became a puzzle piece, forcing investigators to cross-reference and triangulate evidence meticulously. Meanwhile, investigators remained acutely aware of the broader implications. This was not just a legal or administrative matter. It was deeply personal and public. Media outlets were already circling, social media speculation was rampant, and public opinion could sway in an instant. Any misstep, any leak, or any misinterpretation could escalate the situation beyond control. Investigators had to work under the pressure of both secrecy and potential scrutiny, knowing that the stakes extended far beyond the walls of the palace. Another layer of complexity involved Meghan herself. While she had made her private admission, her cooperation with the investigation was cautious and measured. Legal advisors were always present, and every interaction was carefully documented. Investigators understood that building trust, maintaining professionalism, and navigating potential legal entanglements were critical to getting the full story. Any misstep in approach could close doors, create defensiveness, or even compromise the investigation entirely. In addition to interviews and document analysis, investigators employed technology to assist their work. Digital forensic teams examined electronic records, metadata, and communication logs. Surveillance footage from the hospitals was reviewed frame by frame. Digital timestamps were cross-referenced against physical records. Even seemingly minor details, like the times emails were sent or files were modified, were scrutinized for irregularities. It was painstaking, precise, and exhaustive work. The team also reviewed the public narrative. Media coverage, social media posts, and public statements by Meghan and Harry were analyzed to identify any discrepancies between what was presented publicly and what the records indicated privately. Investigators noted moments where statements seemed intentionally vague or carefully worded, suggesting a strategy to control perception. Every public interaction became another layer of evidence, potentially shedding light on the private realities behind the headlines. As the investigation deepened, internal palace discussions intensified. Senior officials, legal counsel, and advisors began considering scenarios that would have once seemed unimaginable. What would happen if the anomalies could not be fully explained? How would the monarchy respond if the public learned of Meghan's admission? Could legal, social, or political consequences arise? Each question added pressure, urgency, and complexity to the investigation. Yet, despite the intensity, investigators approached the work systematically, meticulously, and without bias. Their objective was clear: establish the truth, document findings, and provide clarity for the palace, the family, and, eventually, the public. They understood that this was not just about uncovering discrepancies. It was about ensuring that the integrity of the monarchy's records and the reputation of the institution were preserved, regardless of the personal and emotional complications involved. By the end of the initial investigation phase, the team had compiled a wealth of evidence, corroborated anomalies, conflicting testimonies, and patterns suggesting deliberate obfuscation. Each report was carefully cross-checked, every statement verified. Investigators recognized that while they had uncovered significant questions, the full narrative was far from complete. The investigation had only just begun, and the next steps promised revelations that could alter the royal story in ways few could anticipate. And as the palace braced for the findings, one truth was undeniable: the entrance of professional investigators marked a turning point. The discrepancies in Archie and Lilibet's birth records were no longer minor curiosities. They were central to a story that could challenge public perception, disrupt the palace's internal equilibrium, and ultimately expose secrets that had been carefully guarded for years. The palace had always been a place of whispers. Corridors lined with portraits of monarchs past, rooms steeped in centuries of tradition, and staff who had spent their entire careers moving quietly through its halls. But now, those whispers were different. They carried urgency, tension, and a nervous energy that seemed almost tangible. Something had shifted. The discrepancies in Archie and Lilibet's birth records, coupled with Meghan Markle's private admission, had ignited a quiet storm, and everyone in the palace could feel its presence. The first whispers began in the administrative offices, where aides and clerks discussed unusual document requests and the arrival of the high-level investigation team. Phrases like, "It doesn't add up," and "Have you seen the files?" circulated in hushed tones. These were staff members who had never imagined that their daily work could intersect with what would become one of the most sensitive royal controversies in decades. They were careful, extremely careful, but curiosity and concern mingled in ways that were impossible to suppress. As the investigation deepened, whispers spread to more senior personnel. Advisors who had spent years navigating palace politics suddenly found themselves confronted with questions that had no precedent. Conversations that would normally be mundane, about schedules, event planning, or ceremonial duties, now carried an undercurrent of fear and speculation. Who knew what? Who was involved? And what would the ramifications be if the details leaked beyond the palace walls? These whispers were not just idle chatter. They became a form of internal intelligence, a way for staff to test the boundaries of what they could discuss without overstepping confidentiality agreements. Yet, even in their caution, patterns began to emerge. Staff noticed that certain rooms were locked more often, that meetings were scheduled in private, and that advisors moved with a heightened sense of vigilance. The air of secrecy was almost palpable, feeding the whispers, which fed back into an atmosphere of uncertainty and intrigue. One particularly sensitive area of whispering involved the children's caretakers. Staff members responsible for Archie and Lilibet were suddenly subject to intense scrutiny. Questions about daily routines, presence at key events, and adherence to instructions became routine. While no accusations were made publicly, the underlying tension was clear. Everyone wanted to ensure that no detail went unnoticed, and everyone wanted to protect themselves from potential scrutiny. Palace insiders reported that the staff began forming their own theories, sometimes in contradiction to official statements. Some believed the discrepancies were clerical errors, innocent mistakes in an overwhelming bureaucracy. Others whispered about deliberate concealment or the involvement of surrogacy or third-party caretakers. The problem, however, was that these were only theories, educated guesses based on partial information. In a place where misinformation could be as dangerous as truth, every whisper carried risk. The dynamics of trust within the palace began to shift. Long-standing alliances between aides, advisors, and staff were tested. Who could be trusted to maintain confidentiality? Who might inadvertently or intentionally leak information to the press? Senior officials noted subtle changes in behavior, staff avoiding certain topics, hesitating in their speech, or even refusing to enter certain rooms. The palace, usually a picture of composure and decorum, had become a network of cautious interactions and subtle signaling. Even the royals themselves were affected by the whisper network. While the king and queen maintained public composure, sources suggest that private discussions were increasingly influenced by what staff were saying behind the scenes. Advisors reported instances where decisions about public statements or security protocols were debated intensely because of rumors circulating among employees. Whispers were not just noise. They were shaping the palace's internal decision-making process. Media attention outside the palace began to add another layer of complexity. Though the public was unaware of the details, journalists and royal commentators sensed that something significant was unfolding. Stories about Meghan and Harry, previously framed in terms of lifestyle choices or media appearances, now carried undertones of secrecy and suspicion. Palace staff were acutely aware that leaks could occur at any moment, and the pressure to maintain discretion became almost suffocating. According to insiders, the whispers reached a critical point during the investigation's early stages. Investigators noted that some staff members were unusually anxious, asking questions about procedural consequences or hypothetical scenarios. Others were evasive, offering vague statements or claiming memory lapses. For the team, this behavior was not surprising. It was a natural human response to high-pressure secrecy, but it added layers of complexity to an already delicate operation. Interestingly, the whisper network also revealed a generational divide within the palace. Younger staff members, accustomed to social media and instant information, struggled to contain curiosity. They were fascinated by the unfolding story, unable to resist speculating or quietly sharing their thoughts. Older staff, steeped in tradition and long experience with royal discretion, were more cautious, often offering advice about the importance of silence and professionalism. These generational tensions subtly influenced the flow of information and the palace atmosphere. But not all whispers were negative. Some staff members expressed loyalty to Meghan, quietly emphasizing her contributions and the challenges she had faced within the royal family. Others remained staunchly loyal to the institution, concerned primarily with maintaining the monarchy's reputation. The coexistence of these differing loyalties created an intricate web of subtle communication, influencing decisions in ways that the investigators had to consider carefully. Sources indicate that the palace also began implementing additional layers of information control. Sensitive discussions were moved to secure rooms, communications were encrypted, and staff were reminded of the legal implications of sharing information. Every whisper now had potential consequences, heightening anxiety and shaping behavior in ways that were unprecedented in recent history. Through it all, Meghan herself remained a figure at the center of the storm. Though she was miles away from the palace physically, the whispers about her, what she had admitted, what she knew, and what she might do next, permeated every corner. Staff reported moments of speculation about her motivations, her intentions, and even the possible legal or public ramifications of her statements. Meghan had become both the subject and the source of the whispers, a magnetic force drawing attention in every direction. As the days turned into weeks, the whispers did more than circulate. They shaped the narrative inside the palace. Decisions about document access, interview protocols, and media strategy were all influenced by the underlying tension. Staff became more cautious, meetings longer, and communications more deliberate. Even seemingly mundane decisions, like scheduling events or approving travel, were filtered through the lens of secrecy and speculation. Ultimately, the whispers behind palace walls were not just idle chatter. They were the pulse of a palace in crisis. They reflected fear, curiosity, loyalty, and anxiety all at once. They revealed fractures in relationships, shifts in trust, and the human complexity of an institution that, from the outside, appears monolithic and unflappable. For the investigators, the whispers provided both insight and challenge, offering clues about human behavior while complicating efforts to establish an objective understanding of the situation. And yet, despite the pervasive tension and speculation, one thing remained certain. the whispers were merely the prelude to something far more dramatic. They hinted at secrets yet to be revealed, truths yet to be confronted, and consequences that could redefine the monarchy forever. Secrecy is the palace's lifeblood. For centuries, confidentiality has been meticulously maintained within its walls, enforced by tradition, loyalty, and strict protocols. Yet, even the most secure institutions are vulnerable when human curiosity, fear, and ambition converge, and that is exactly what began to unfold in the days following Meghan Markle's private admission. The first leaks were subtle. A line in an off-the-record interview here, a whisper to a trusted journalist there. At first, the palace dismissed them as coincidence or exaggeration, isolated incidents blown out of proportion by media imagination. But patterns emerged. Names, dates, and events began to surface in publications with an accuracy that could not be easily dismissed. Every leak, no matter how small, amplified anxiety within the palace, and each one hinted at deeper secrets buried in the investigation of Archie and Lilibet's birth records. Sources indicate that the initial leaks were strategic, whether intentional or inadvertent. Insiders with access to sensitive information began to test the boundaries of discretion. They gauged how far information could travel, how journalists would respond, and how quickly the palace would attempt to suppress it. Each leak became a breadcrumb, and the public, unaware of the full context, began to speculate wildly. The palace response was swift but cautious. Investigators increased surveillance of communications. Staff were reminded, firmly and repeatedly, of confidentiality agreements. Meetings were moved to secure locations, and access to sensitive documents was restricted even further. Yet, the leaks continued. In some cases, journalists cited unnamed sources who seemed to have intimate knowledge of the investigation. In others, information emerged indirectly, through seemingly unrelated stories or casual comments that, when pieced together, revealed startling details. What made these leaks especially dangerous was the subject matter. Birth records, lineage, and parentage are not trivial details in the royal world. They touch on legality, succession, public perception, and the personal identities of those involved. Even a small leak could spark global controversy. And in the age of social media, speculation spread faster than official statements, creating a feedback loop of rumor, interpretation, and amplification. Insiders reported that the palace's security and legal teams began to treat the leaks as a crisis within a crisis. Investigations were launched to identify the sources, ranging from digital forensic analysis of emails and messaging platforms to subtle questioning of staff behavior. Yet the very act of tightening security seemed to intensify suspicion. Staff became more guarded, more cautious in their communications, and more inclined to share tidbits selectively, knowing that absolute secrecy was nearly impossible. The content of the leaks varied. Some hinted at the anomalies in the birth records, mentioning missing signatures, altered dates, or irregular documentation. Others alluded to Meghan's private admission without quoting her directly, creating a shroud of intrigue that the media eagerly amplified. Even partial truths were enough to fuel headlines, social media speculation, and public fascination. In essence, the leaks became a controlled chaos, simultaneously revealing and concealing, creating tension while withholding full clarity. One particularly significant leak involved the timing of Archie's birth. A journalist with insider knowledge reported discrepancies between the official birth announcement and what staff recalled privately. The story implied that the palace had withheld information from the public, a revelation that generated immediate media frenzy. While the report did not name Meghan directly, it framed the situation as one of secrecy and potential deception, prompting intense speculation. Meanwhile, social media amplified the effect exponentially. Hashtags trended, memes circulated, and online forums buzzed with theories ranging from plausible to outrageous. Some commentators questioned the legitimacy of the birth records. Others speculated about surrogacy, adoption, or even more sensational possibilities. In this environment, facts became difficult to distinguish from conjecture, and the palace's task of controlling narrative and perception grew exponentially more complex. Palace insiders noted that leaks also affected internal morale. Staff who were loyal to the monarchy but sympathetic to Meghan felt caught in the middle. They were pressured to maintain discretion while witnessing their private environment publicly dissected. Tension between departments increased as accusations, even subtle ones, flew in corridors and offices. Investigators recognized that managing the human factor was as crucial as managing the documents themselves. Legal implications of the leaks were also quickly assessed. The palace's legal team reviewed whether confidential information had been improperly disclosed and whether any action could be taken against the sources. However, pursuing legal action was fraught with risk. Any public acknowledgement of wrongdoing could draw attention to sensitive matters the palace wanted to keep private, potentially exacerbating the very scandal they hoped to contain. Interestingly, the leaks revealed not only facts but also motives. Observers noted that certain leaks seemed designed to shape perception, to test reactions, or to influence palace strategy. Was someone inside attempting to pressure Meghan, sway internal decision-making, or preempt official statements? Or were the leaks simply the result of uncontrolled curiosity and mismanagement of confidential information? Investigators could not yet say for sure, adding another layer of complexity to the unfolding story. The palace attempted subtle interventions to curb the leaks. Communication protocols were reinforced. Meetings regarding sensitive matters were limited to essential personnel. Even routine staff interactions were monitored with an unusual level of attention. But the speed and reach of information, combined with human unpredictability, meant that complete containment was impossible. And then came a